see how this goes. So we'll take
Under promise, over deliver.
Well, it's a pulse check from the group. So Chuck and I, along with Haley and Brendan and Kelly, planned this out for meeting today. We have, is it 2 or 3 other meetings, Kelly? 2 other meetings, yeah. Two meetings after this one on the schedule, excuse me. But Dr. Henry's promised to be my advisor for the summer, and we're going to solve all the problems with the independent study that I'm doing. So we're going to do some breakout groups, get into this meeting today, and then we'll see how we feel after this meeting. So it is up to the group whether we do 2 more meetings. We'll do a vote at the end. Kelly, you want to start us off with the roll call? You're on mute. Yeah.
If work group members could just type their name into the chat for attendance, that would be awesome. We are a small group today, so if you could just mute yourself when you're not talking, and either questions in chat, raise your hand, or just jump right in. Any of the above right now. And then this meeting is being recorded for posting. And approval of the minutes. I apologize for getting them out late. If you've had time to read them, awesome. If not, we can vote later.
Move approval.
All right.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Good answer. All right, minutes are approved. Turn it back to you all.
Meeting goals. Today, legislative update. So just tell you what's happening in the world. Update from our consortium meeting. So we had that last week and then discussed the path forward, which is what I'll be getting in today. Part of the feedback we've gotten from our team is to have some more time to reflect and discuss, but then also to share out. And so Dr. Henry pointed out one time that we didn't have time to share out as a group, so to know what other groups are thinking. So we'll have that time today and then discuss our path forward. Next slide, get into the legislation. So the ones we had approved, Senate Bill 56, opportunity funding, has passed the Senate 20-0 with a 1. Released from House Education Committee so far. So it's still gaining steam and moving forward. We also, House Bill 86 passed out of the House Education, assigned to House Appropriations Committee, and that's the K-3 Basic Spec Ed. House Bill 100 was Mental Health Services Unit for Elementary Schools, passed House Education, assigned to House Appropriations Committee, and then a House amendment was introduced. So that's where we are with what we've been doing. Consortium meeting update. Chuck.
Okay, so we did bring this work group's this committee's equity statement regulation recommendation to the larger consortium. And so this is the statement as it stands. And as we said, it does check the box as to what was in the settlement. Next slide, please. These are some recommendations that this committee discussed. And so these were presented to the consortium and they endorsed the recommendations during the consortium overall meeting. And so hopefully, and Dr. Bunning, thanks for coming tonight. So don't know if this will go through the process and come your way, but if it does, if you need any help trying to word things to get it in the new regulation, we're happy to help. If it doesn't, we still ask you to have your folks consider some of the ideas that we put forward in here as far as transparency and connection to a larger equity plan and building assessment at the districts. Thanks. Next slide. All right. Aaron, I think this is yours.
Sure, the ombudsperson. We discussed earlier about the ombudsperson, so we were making some revisions and changes. The update, if you go back, you can leave right here. So the update to it, we did not do a final vote because DOE had already submitted the RFP. We've already had conversation about that process. The date for the RFP has been pushed back. So I'll even put the link in the chat if I don't get beat by Haley or by Kelly. The date's been pushed back for until, what's the date, Dr. Bunty? Is it June? June 2nd or is it May?
I think they said 2 weeks, Aaron, but I don't know when the original closing date was. So I think they added 2 weeks to the process.
Perfect. So 2 weeks been added to the process to have more people engage in the process. I've also been sharing it through email and through social media. So if anybody else is interested, feel free to do that. There is a member from the Reading Consortium who is expected to be on the RFP committee. And then questions are also being submitted right now if you have any to DOE. So at this point, it's outside of the Reading Consortium. And we've also talked about communication. So moving forward, we want to make sure that we are all on the same page. And the link is actually in the chat right now. Boom. Deadline for bid responses is June 2nd. Deadline for questions is May 13th. Yep, thank you. Response to questions posted May 20th. And then June 2nd is the actual deadline. So July, the process will close. And then at that point, announcing who will be the ombudsperson for the state of Delaware. And again, that is for each county, Sussex, Kent, and also for Newcastle County. So lots more to do with that. We will continue to, as our charge is to also, one, be proactive and share information and updates, but two is also be a watchdog. So we'll be making sure that we want to see the best thing happen for our students. Then moving on, reflection on the settlement. Who wants to take? Here's what to do in work groups. We want to reflect on the settlement. We have been pretty active, and I know it's interesting considering we're in a consortium and we are a more smaller and nimble group, but have also been helpful with leading consortium members on just understanding the settlement as well as on legislation. So we wanted to look at just how we've been doing this year, because we want to use this time today to prepare for the future. At the end of this, as I started off and said, our next 2 meetings will be decided after in this meeting if we're going to have them or not, because we're going to start looking at what are the next steps as we plan for next year. So if you hit the next slide, Kelly. Chuck.
All right. So this is the nice graphic that UDIPA put together that shows all of the parts of the settlement that we are watching here. So current fiscal year is 2021. It's the leftmost column. That's the one we're in now. We're looking forward to 22, which is the blue highlighted. So opportunity funding, we did find that at least what's proposed so far does, I think it actually exceeds the minimum by 3 million, if I remember correctly. I think it does. Okay. What we're doing this year is for next year for the blue. So what we're talking about now is also looking forward to the next one, 2023. I got to get my fiscal year straight. So I was thinking, wait a minute, I remember the number 38 somewhere. And so I think that this for next year, it is slated to be 38 if I have my numbers right. So the year after that, it looks like we don't have an increase over and above this upcoming fiscal year, but we do hope to see something. We hope to see that ratcheted up year over year over year. K-3 basic special education, we're happy that there is legislation out there to address that earlier than is required. It's taking a ramp up kind of approach. So I know we all support that legislation, and we hope to see its success for next fiscal year and forward. Next slide. Early education, Ecap, we are still at the 6.1 that I'm aware. We do want that to double. We would like to see some number in there for fiscal year 2023 as we go forward. So that's something we'll be watching for. Teacher recruitment and retention. Remind me, is there something additional already in for this upcoming year? No, there's not. There's not. So we're looking for the additional commitment in 2023. So we'll be watching for that. And is there other language around that too? The teacher recruitment and retention, is there an equity component to that we have to watch for? What other things are part of that? 'Cause I've been concentrated on the 22 stuff. So,
So we don't have an ACLU here today. I know Dr. Bunting is here, but the $4 million commitment to, in addition to FY21 allocation, was not necessarily committed towards equity and for DEI work. Although I do know that's something that recommendations for this came out of the Educator work group for the settlement. For a writing consortium, and is also something that we would like to be working with them on and collaborating. Again, that funding is set up for 2023. The DOE, the governor's office, as well as OMB and the legislature can approve funding earlier, but I haven't seen anything for 2022 for that. But I definitely want to see us tackling some of that next year.
all right. The next one up. Kelly, can you get us back to the chart? The next one was the ombudsperson, I believe, and that is moving quickly. Equity statement, moving, it already moved quickly. An independent funding assessment, we put to include sufficient funding to do this independent funding assessment. I don't recall that we saw any of it in for 22, right? But there's got to be something in there for 23 because you can't complete it by January 2024 unless you're working on it ahead of time. So before we move on, I do want to say that nobody in the world can say that DOE moves slowly because DOE was on top of the equity statement and the ombudsperson RFP. So we got to keep our eyes open. So, I think we're going to want, as a consortium, some function on shaping some of these things, especially the teacher recruitment and retention, because we do have an educator work group focused on equity, and the funding assessment because we do have a funding and governance work group that's focused on equity. So anything that we can do to get in on the ground floor of that is absolutely appreciated. Next slide.
So now we get to the discussion of the path forward. I can say that one thing that I had already mentioned to Secretary Bunting's here, but to others as well, is that we want to be as proactive as possible. And so making sure that we're getting framework and communication out there, we're thinking out our processes ahead of time. We're also having conversations with community stakeholders and the various groups that we work with, so we can make sure that we get to having just vested interest in conversations and we speak with knowledge. So our plan is to do that in communication with the governor's office and with DOE, so that we can also hold our role, which is not that we decide anything. We're not the executives, and neither are we the ACLU, DEO, or the NAACP, but we want to make sure that we are involved. So the path forward discussion is this next part right here. We're going to get into, and I want to bring it out to the group. We had planned today to do some breakout rooms. Notice some competing meetings today, but the breakout rooms were teacher recruitment and retention, independent funding assessment, and opportunity funding. And so for the breakout rooms, two basic questions: what information do we need? And the strategy for ensuring we are heard and making sure we hear from the right people. So that was the plan for today in this meeting. Do this in the breakout room and then do a share out, so everyone can hear what each group came up with and also share the ideas from that. After this point, that share out with next steps, we're going to discuss whether or not we need to do our next meetings, which are going to be May 24th and June 14th. The reason we had questions around those two meetings, legislation is pretty much done as far as writing as moving to June 30th. And so at this point, we will not be approving or supporting any new legislation between now and June 14th, because there will not be any that we're expecting to be introduced in the lane of education, although we might. So it's up to the group. But before we get into discussing the future meetings, wanted to ask first off, how do people want to do the breakout rooms? Should we discuss this all together as it's a smaller, more nimble group tonight, or should we go into breakout rooms? That's for the group to either put in the chat or to unmute these three topics.
Aaron, I would just say for my part, these three things are closely interrelated in my view in very important ways. And I think a discussion of all three would be helpful, but if for time's sake, we'll be better off in breakout rooms. I think that's certainly an acceptable way to go, but recruitment and retention needs to be something we think alongside of the opportunity funding, and the independent funding assessment is something that I think is really critical to all of this too. So my 2 cents.
Well, Gary, I think you spoke for the entire chat, because as you were speaking, it's unanimous, do it all together. So we have the time. So we're actually scheduled for 6:30, but we sometimes end earlier. So we'll go from the top, which means there's no share out because we're all involved in this one conversation. And Kristen joined in, so glad to see you as well.
Hey, Aaron, can I ask a quick question?
Go right ahead.
So if we're doing this all together now instead of breakouts, do you want me to just sort of time maybe the first conversation for 10 minutes, give you a check-in, and then we can decide, if we want to move on to the next topic or keep on the same one?
Yeah, that'd be great. So a 10-minute
Okay.
timer, and we'll go from there. Good to see you too, Shannon. First topic, the first question, and I'll say it out loud because I wanted to see people's faces. Teacher recruitment and retention is the first one. The questions that we had proposed were, what information do we need? And the strategy for ensuring we are heard and making sure we hear from the right people. Those are just 2 guiding questions. We are not stuck with those 2 questions. So if there's something else in here that you're going, hey, I'd love to hear more about this, we can go off of that. The plan is gather information that what we need to be doing over the course of the summer and planning out our year for next year.
I've gone ahead and copied and pasted the high needs, the teacher recruitment piece into the chat so we can see what the settlement actually says. So it definitely does have, well, it says recruitment and retention in high needs schools. So it's an equity component is definitely strongly implied there, although it doesn't say equity straight up. But so maybe we discuss a little bit about from our role as a consortium, what we expect to see and what, if any, shaping of this that we feel that we need to or could do, or what does that all look like?
So just to get the conversation rolling, I would say that of all the reforms in high need schools that I've seen that have been successful, every single one of them has had a strong component for teacher recruitment and retention, and that they're simply unlikely to be successful without recruiting teachers who have the capacity to care for and teach students in these schools. So that I think it needs to be woven into the overall efforts in terms of the opportunity funding and so forth. There are a ton of different models, and there was a very successful model in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, for instance, where new principals were hired and they were allowed to recruit and pay bonuses depending on the size of the schools for between 5 and 10 teachers. And I think that's really a great plan. In Memphis, they used teacher signing and retention bonuses. So there's a lot of different ways this can be organized. These efforts can be organized, and I feel like a broad-based discussion of how those might take place for high need school would be very useful to talk about. The information we need, I'd say, is the evidence from other states that have proven to be successful in recruiting and retaining high quality teachers for high need schools. And I don't know who the right people are generally, but there's a small group of folks that we're organizing some sessions for the fall that have done research on these topics, and I think we could probably access them through the summer or early fall if we chose to, because this doesn't have a due date until the following year. So we've got a little bit of time if we're going to pursue it.
Got it. Two things to note. So Kelly put in the chat the Educator work group recommendations. And we told them, and they also presented to us earlier because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So that's there. And thank you for getting us information about that information in the fall. Love to get that. I saw Kristen, you have your hand up.
So I just wanted to put in the room, we're starting in fiscal year 2023. So we're building the budget for fiscal year 2022. I would imagine that at this time, these conversations around teacher recruitment and retention have already happened, or if not already happening at the department. So I'd just be really interested to hear, what ideas the department has, but then so that we don't find ourselves playing catch up with the department, but rather working together as in a collaborative way, because I saw what happened with the ombudsman person. I saw all of that and what happened, and just I saw what happened with the equity statement. Like we're playing catch up here. So I think it's a little. I'd rather work together and in tandem, and that. Just saying that. And then second, for me, I'd like to. Dr. Henry is looking at other states and what they've been successful in implementing. And I'd be interested in understanding the success or lack thereof of the Christina MOU that was put forward a couple of years ago that drafted some recruitment incentives for teachers in the high need schools. And like I said, either success or lack thereof, what we felt worked, what we felt failed. Also looking at past recruitment efforts here in Delaware. The talent cooperative is something that consistently comes to mind as something that was a lot of money, a lot of effort, not as good of a return as folks had anticipated they would have. And not necessarily because people may or may not have been interested in the money. I'm sure everyone was interested in the money. Maybe it was some of the rules around getting the money. So if there was, just to take a look at that and see what worked, what failed. Certainly at the time, we had a punch list of things that we felt were failing and nobody was listening. So maybe if we could have the conversation again, that would be helpful. And then I'd actually also ask, for those who are doing this research, to look towards other states that have active unions and how they worked with those local unions to incentivize recruitment and retention, and their successes and failures. So those are just three thoughts I had. Thank you.
I agree with Jamal. Hey Tika. I agree with everything. I would also add in that looking at educators of color, there's been a lot of conversation in the state about that and within other states, and having educators of color and males of color, especially in our younger grades, 3 through 5 specifically, that would be huge in seeing some changes. There's a great study that, where is it? Johns Hopkins out of North Carolina, the Papa George study. But there's many more that have looked at the impact of educators of color. And I do think that our institutions, not just DOE, but also within districts and within charters, need to be altered to retain, especially retaining people of color. And what are the systematic things in place here, systemic things that are keeping us from doing that? What else like to add to that conversation?
Hey, I took some notes on Kristen when you said the thing about the Christina MOU And I might be able to put a word into somebody to actually maybe try to get some of that information. I don't know, I might have a connection or two, but it would be nice to know what kind of metrics we would look at to say whether it has been successful or not. It's really, I mean, a lot of people like to go to test scores, but it's kind of a wonky testing year. And we all know too that test scores aren't the be all end all, but if and we don't have to decide it tonight, but if anybody comes up with some kind of things that we could look at and study to see whether we consider it a success or not, it would really be, it would be a nice thing, and I can pass that on within the district.
And Aaron, I would suggest if we do have another meeting, that we have John Neubauer come and talk about the particulars about what they're doing to strengthen the, I do know that he has asked, and we have allocated some of our monies from CRRSA funds to specifically, it says strengthen the teacher pipeline. And it references that awareness that we need to be having more people participate in existing programs that are designed to create a diverse and sustainable pipeline of educators. So I know that's a target of his work group, his team, and we might want to find out, or I could ask and then get that to Haley to get out to you if we don't have another meeting.
Definitely appreciate it.
And thank you for calling out the educators of color, linguistically diverse educators, along with male educators, because the research certainly substantiates the need and the positive impact of all of the above. One thing that I'd like to note when we think about the retention of educators of color, male educators, and linguistically diverse educators, we have to build culturally competent environments through a continuum of professional learning in order to retain educators who reflect dimensions of diversity. That is not being done. The only district that I can think of that does this with an intentional focus has been Colonial for consecutive years through Betsy Fleetwood. And she shared that many of her challenges are around professional learning and creating environments that are welcoming and support educators belonging. And this is something that our team has been, the Office of Equity and Innovation has been honing in on, those dimensions of diversity, the research and evidence around that, along with specific actions that are aligned to impact versus generalizing it or camouflaging it within the masses of all educators.
Definitely appreciate and agree.
Aaron, to add a little bit to this topic, I was on the subgroup that worked on the teacher recruitment and retention. And we talked a lot about a whole group professional development model from Laurel that, again, as we looked at how we could best invest our CRRSA monies, ESSER 2 is what it's easier to say. We put in funding to do, to make that project happen in several of the high need schools. So that's something that we will give a try and see how it works, and then whether or not it is something that we want to grow it to even more high need schools.
And Secretary, glad to have you here. There's work being done with proposals and with professional development. Is there any work being done with interviewing staff and staff of color about what they would want in different districts in DOE to stay in Delaware?
I'm not, it's not coming out of the Secretary's office right now, but I can certainly ask that question. I'm not aware of that. And I don't know what's happening at the district level. We don't actually do any hiring at our level for schools, but we have conversations, of course, with our folks as they come and they go about what would be something that would attract them or entice them to stay. But I will be with the chiefs on Friday. I certainly can ask some of those questions as well.
And I would even ask I think is look at the settlement, and we're looking at $4 million in 2023 to recruit and retain people. I think there should also be some conversation with those people we're trying to serve, so that those educators can tell you, because I've had a number tell me why they're leaving, or the other taxes they might have, especially even for educators of color and predominantly white staffs that also have another tax. And I think that might be worth our time, so we can actually put the money where it needs to be. But again, I think that goes to the question about strategy to ensure that we're hearing from the right people. And I think everyone here is competent, but also know not everyone on this settlement committee is a classroom teacher. So I think it's for all of us.
Aaron, at some point there has been, I know that, again, in our conversations with that particular subgroup, it was either a study that was cited or else it was something done here in Delaware, and I can go back and find that out. One of the main things that they cite is leadership, which I thought was a very interesting. It's not necessarily money, but the leadership makes a big difference in whether or not they stay or they seek another place of employment. And I can add that to a list of questions for John.
And that was Secretary. I remember them talking about that being one of the top reasons. I'm trying to see if I have a link to it.
That was an extensive conversation with the educator group. I recall that. And actually, we just had a meeting earlier today, to your point, Aaron, about the conversations. And there are some, I know of at least one group that has kind of blossomed in the last few months. So talking to of teachers of color. And so if we can have a group that actually we are engaging with to hear right from Delaware educators, what keeps them here, what is drawing them away, and make sure that whatever we do is not just based on patterns across the country, but actually based on our Delaware context. That is going to be key. And if we can then align our strategies in such a way that's addressing those needs and communicate what's happening in Delaware to those educators, I think that's going to be, that's a huge engagement approach beyond just doing behind the scenes stuff. We were just talking about this morning in a Rodell meeting on this very subject. So I'm glad to hear you bring that up.
And
Great
Haley's
point,
taking notes too.
Shelley. I was going to add, I remember when we were in the DLRT, one of our recommendations was to do just that, survey educators of color for all of the reasons that were just stated. As a result of our recommendation, the work group actually created an educator mobility survey, but it was all educators who were exiting or moving from one place to another within the state. And 78% of the responses actually cited support, well, lack thereof, as a reason for leaving, but more specifically, they cited cultural incompetence as a reason for leaving. So the lack of cultural responsiveness was a major reason for people leaving Delaware schools. Nerman Zubaka actually administered that survey, and his plan was to administer it every year. I think the pandemic may have interrupted some parts of his plan, but he's the person who administered that survey. And we still have the standing question with the Delaware Diversifying the Educator Work Group of how can we, and Nerman is a part of that work group, how can we create a survey that focuses on educators of color or educators who reflect the dimensions of diversity, because the DLRT team that Shelley was a part of more than 2 years ago requested that we have such a survey. And my fear is that we're reinventing the wheel. And I heard Kristen early on point out what happened with the posting of the position along with the statement. So I don't want this to appear or experience any redundancy in the process. I just wanted to make you aware of those things.
Appreciate it. Kristen.
Actually, it was a Rodell survey that actually, I think was what you were referring to, Susan, that note that specified that leadership was the biggest reason teachers were leaving. When I presented along with Dr. Henry, I talked about leadership. I also talked about support. It's no secret, we are lobbying hard for House Bill 100. And one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we get from folks who are not supportive of the bill as written is that, come on, Kristen, you know that educators aren't going to want to go work in the high needs schools. That's what I get. And my response to you is, what do you think educators want in order to work in a high needs school? They want these kinds of resources. They want to know that when a child is having difficulty in class or at home, whatever it may be, there's a person available that is there to help. And that's what House Bill 100 does. It's starting to create those building blocks of resources in these schools that we know they need. It's not just in the social emotional environment either. There's a lot, I talk a lot about community schools, because the kids in these schools and the educators that are there to support them need to draw on a number of resources, whether it has to do with curricula or family supports, just their everyday basic needs in order to get them in a capacity to learn. And so the biggest part of making sure that house functions is that school leader. What we did find in that Rodell study as well is salary is a component, but it's not necessarily the highest thing, right? It is a draw, but it can't keep them there forever, because burnout is a very real thing. And if you don't have the resources, no matter how driven you are to help these kids, you're going to burn out. You got to do it for yourself. You're just going to have to walk away at one point in time. And then it kind of opens the door for the next person. Something else that kind of came up as a reason why people leave, which struck me, was facilities conditions, right? If you walk into a building every single day and you're like, oh man, did anybody fix the HVAC yet? Because it's really hot in here. There's only so many days, you're going to want to keep working in that environment. When we went up to Springfield, Massachusetts, one of to talk about their structure. And Dr. Bunting, you may remember a school board member said, if you don't feed the teachers, they're going to eat the students. And it's like, that has always stuck in my mind, because I know he was being cute and funny, but I was like, there's something to be said about, supporting the educators who are there to support the kids. If they don't have support, how can they support kids? And that is a large part of the conversation about recruitment and retention. So I did want to point out, what you were referencing. I just recently saw it, Dr. Bunting. It came from Rodell. A lot of really good information there.
Just want to get a pulse check. So I'll get to Dr. Henry. We had 3 topics, and Chuck and I set up an arbitrary timeline. So it's not something that we're held to by the legislature. I would venture to say that we might continue in this conversation, especially because we're planning for next year, and make sure that we spend adequate time on independent funding assessment, because that's a completely different bucket that needs adequate time, as well as opportunity funding, which I think blends into teacher recruitment and retention, as well as independent funding assessment, but again, is a separate bucket. So can I just get a pulse check from the group? Are we fine to continue this conversation and plan on May 24th meeting again? Or people want to stick with the timeline of, we rush it all today, plan for the summer in darkness, and then come back and tell you that, everyone gets a Twinkie and that's the thing that saved education? Cliff, you're on mute.
24th.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Okay, so moving for the 24th. Other people? Monique in the chat, direction doesn't serve. Perfect. Yeah. Okay, good. So I wanted to, I didn't want to rush through and then we not spend adequate time. So things I'm hearing, and Kelly and Haley are taking copious notes. One, again, with the communication piece, and so glad to see Secretary Bunting here, but then also making sure we're in conversation with the governor's office, with DOE, with the Reading Consortium, and with members of the ACLU and the NAACP and DEO, because we're the settlement group. So we're not any of those entities. Some of us actually are on this call, but we're not necessarily deciding. So we want to make sure we're in communication, that we're not repeating the same stuff, and that we are at the forefront, because what we don't want to do is be in a situation again where there's already a plan written and we're behind on what we're doing.
We also, I'm hearing, we also want to ensure alignment with the educator work group, so that we're supporting what they do, because they've already, I know there was a link to their report. They've already done some of this, some of the groundwork. So we're hoping that what they do is an integral part of what we do with the, what happens with the $4 million.
And just also calling out that what I heard from Monique, and I see this, recruitment is not the same as retention. Money can get you in the door, but money will not sustain you. So we don't want to remove people's salaries from teachers or from leaders, but at the same time, to what we're hearing from Kristen, from Monique, from others in the chat, yeah, we got to make sure, how are we keeping people, and how are we keeping people in Delaware? Because I find too often I've argued with people about strategies of competing with New York, DC, and Baltimore and Philly. You're not going to win, because that's not what Delaware is going to win on. So what is unique about Delaware? Because we want to market that.
So one of the things I think is important is, and I agree with so many of the comments that Susan and Kristen and others have made, Monique have made, but the way that I think it's helpful to think about this is systemic reform, because there's no single bit that's going to really work for these schools. You can do bonuses and they'll fail because of lack of leadership or culturally responsive work with the community. And so I put in the chat a survey that we did, and again, it's Tennessee, so I'm not saying these results would be similar, but these are all teachers, many of them teachers of color who work in high need schools. And what we did for this survey is say, okay, if you were thinking about a school, moving to a new school, what would you want to see? And you see, if you want to open that up, that at the bottom, it's safety, it's administrative support, it's salary, and consistent enforcement of discipline. That you see the highest percentage of teachers feel that those are important. Their race doesn't come out, student race, student income. We tried to, there's a lot of literature that suggests teachers sort based on student race or income. There's no evidence for that in these surveys, but these are really, I think this survey, the way it was laid out was not why did you leave, but where would you go? Where would you like to go? Because that's the question for recruitment and retention we really need to answer, because they might leave because they didn't like their principal or didn't feel supported. But when they're then starting to think about a decision, and what we did was 3 years after this survey was done, we went back to see for the teachers who had left, did they pick schools that had this quality based on evidence that we had from teacher working condition surveys and other information. And overwhelmingly, they validated these points where safety, administrative support, salary, consistent discipline within the school were among the highest. So salary isn't everything, but it is one thing. And leadership isn't everything, but it is one really, really important thing. And cultural responsiveness isn't everything, but it is really important. So there are really good surveys that have been done that capture and have been capture this kind of information. And I just hope that if we move forward, we don't we don't just do a homegrown survey that may not have the validity that we'd like to have in terms of the responses.
Can I just ask, is that this data real quick, is that based off of recruitment or retention? When was this asked of them?
These are data, they're all teachers who have worked in high need schools. And the question was, if you were thinking about, if you were choosing between different schools where you would go next, sort of what are the more important factors? And there's a fancy statistical procedure that has them trade off. Would you choose X dollars more in salary versus X a higher school that has a higher safety record? And so it makes them trade off those. So you see the decision-making process of teachers. I'm not trying to sell the survey. I'm just saying that the way I believe we should be looking at this and why these three topics tonight fit together is we should be thinking about systemic reform, because you can put the salaries any level you want, but if the teachers don't feel safe, they're not going to stay in that school a long time, you know? So you really have to look at the package. And I think that's the next step for it might be in the educator work group, it might be in our work group, but no single shot is going to address recruitment and retention. It has to be a multifaceted, systemic reform package.
And Monique agrees with you.
Yes, this is Rashawn Austin. I was going to chime in. Thank you for that. The Delaware Diversify the Educator Workforce has been meeting over the last 2 years, and the group is comprised of educators, administrators, university partners, and community members. And just as he mentioned, this is a systemic issue. There has been a lot of research done by the Education Trust, CCSSO, a number of organizations, and it points to more than just salary. We really have to address what happens to diverse candidates once they get into high need schools. Supportive environments and development is key, but we also cannot, as he said, say, okay, salary is not the only factor. Many of the educators of color in the work group have cited, not feeling valued for the expertise and knowledge that they bring, as well as other systemic factors, such as student loan burdens and things of that nature that just make it really challenging, as well as really not understanding or seeing a clear career path and opportunity for growth and development. So we have put together a number of strategies to support this effort in recruiting more diverse candidates in the state of Delaware, and have been working on that for over 2 years.
Secretary Bunting, so now we have you for our ideation phase, is there a timeline in place from DOE at least for the funding of the $4 million for recruitment and retention in 2023? Is there a timeline set for putting that plan together?
Kim wouldn't know if there's been any conversation. I have not been involved in any of those conversations.
Okay. Who would at DOE?
Kim Klein, if anyone at DOE, but that may not be something that is coming out of DOE. It could be a combination of powers that be with JFC members. It could be starting at any particular place. To be very honest, Aaron, right now we are totally wrapped up in finishing out what we have. In fact, we have bond bill this week, but that and the tremendous weight that the stimulus packages and the paperwork and so forth. So we haven't thought about 3 years from now. We're kind of, we're dealing with the immediate, and state plan, for example, has to be turned in by the 7th of June, I believe it is. So we're not 3 years out right now. We're totally absorbed in financing immediately. Although, you know, the last stimulus package does take us a few years out, but that wouldn't be necessarily the funding line that you're referencing.
Perfect. And as a school leader that is receiving those funds, I would encourage you to continue your work on the funding for this year. We appreciate that. I think for us, we'll investigate some more because we want to make sure for the timelines that we're ahead of the curve. And I wouldn't expect you to have a date today, but more so we'd like to be in that conversation just to add some other perspective as we move together. I also know that the Office of Equity and Innovation seems like they're doing a lot of great work there. So love to continue seeing them operate there because we'd love to pull those resources out. And the legislature would love to see that, especially if we're looking at some funding for the future.
Aaron, if I can add a little plug right now. I've talked with Haley about a 1.5 pager. It's front and back of a sheet, but it explains a little bit more about the American Rescue Plan monies. And we have 3 questions. When you talk about planning and involving people, we're really hoping to get as many people as we possibly can throughout the state. And we're arranging to do this with student groups here and there. And with, I'm going to speak to the School Board Association on Wednesday evening. And so every group we can get to, we take our little sheets with us. And there are 3 questions that we very much want to have input from stakeholders, educators, you know, parents, all of the people that would like to have a say. And we will compile that information as we begin to plan out how we would propose to use our AR. So Haley has it just in case anybody wants to help and give us some input. There is a website that you can just enter your written comments. And they're simple questions. You know, 1, what impact has the COVID experience had? Not doing this verbatim. Secondly, what can we do about those? And how do we involve community groups, a broader base of Delawareans in working towards solutions or suggestions and implementation of those suggestions for helping provide that relief. And Kristen, it does mention academic, but also the social and emotional needs. You'll see that threaded throughout those 3 questions. So I really would ask if anybody can take the time to answer those 3 questions. We really appreciate the input, and it will make a dramatic difference in what we are proposing when we do get to the point of putting dollar figures and categories for at our level. Now, there is, I hope, a similar process going on in districts, because to be frank, we have we can retain 10% at the department of all the monies coming in. So we have about $41 million, but about 28 million, 20, somewhere around that, is a set aside amount that has to be invested in 5% of the total package. And that's almost $411 million for the whole state has to be invested. 10% of that, 5% of that, and we have to set that aside. Pulling it out from what goes to the districts has to be invested in what they label as learning loss. Another has to do with a 1% investment in summer enrichment, and there's another 1% that has to be invested. So that takes about roughly 28 million of the 40 million that we have, 41 million that we have at the department. So what we would be asking your input would be information that would influence the discretionary funds that we have, which is about $13 million, 12, 13, something like that. So any help is appreciated. We really do want to hear from our Delawareans.
Will do. And that's also in the chat. Kelly just put it there. So
thank you.
Yep. And the 410 million, 733, so 411 million is what we're looking at.
And 90% of that goes out, of course, immediately to districts. Yep. based on their basically it's their Title I representation.
Yep. Okay. So I know we're getting stuff from Rashawn's information from the Office of Equity and Innovation, and Monique, I know we're getting things from the Christina MOU. I know there is a few of the data sources. So I know, Gary, you're sending us stuff as well, the Kelly and the Haley. Are there any other people we should be gathering information from, or data sets we should be looking at?
This, I don't know if this is a Dr. Bunning or Dr. Henry thing, or who can find this out, but in places where they've had success, I'd be interested in knowing whether it's kind of done from the state level or the LEA level or what, because $4 million, it's a lot of money, yet it's not a lot of money. And then when you carve it up and you give it to LEAs, it's a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money. And one thing that I am personally, I mean, this isn't me talking as a Christina person, but just as a person who tries to see, okay, what can go wrong with tweaking a funding methodology. But if it's not a statewide unified approach, then you'll have, you know, Red Clay doing one thing, Brandywine doing another thing, Colonial and Christina doing another thing, and we might be trying to snipe people from each other. And as we know, in the city of Wilmington, you could go one block this way, one block that way, 3 blocks that way, and then 3 blocks back, and be in 4 different districts, 5 actually with Newcastle Votech. So it would be interesting to know if the strategy of this $4 million is a unified, same approach so that we don't end up competing, or if it's going to be something where every LEA puts in their own proposal and, you know, you just have 1,000 different ideas out there. And I don't know which one's best. I'd like to know if anybody has that expertise to find out what the better approach is, because what we need to do is it needs to be high need schools attracting from great people from either, you know, new to the profession or from not as high need schools, or retaining great people in high need schools, not one high need school to another. You know what I'm saying?
So Chuck, if it's of interest, we did a couple of studies in Memphis, and I can share these with you, where we looked at where did the high performing teachers that were recruited and retained in these reform school, high needs reform schools, where did they come from, and what happened to the schools that they left? And so a lot of them did come from other low performing schools that were on the priority list, or which would be comparable to the CSI list now. So there's a lot of really solid research based on these data, based on actual administrative data about the teacher mobility moving around these places. And what I think is the hardest thing, but the most important thing, is that the approaches that districts tend to use, at least in Tennessee and North Carolina, where I'm most familiar, is a one-size-fits-all teacher recruitment and retention policy. So the district has a policy, but they don't want to do things different for high need schools. And unless you do things differently for high need schools, you're going to have a gravitational pull of teachers out of high need schools into easier to staff schools. Let me categorize them that way. There's no study that I'm aware of that doesn't show that. So in my view, if we want to make strategic use of these funds, we need to set up things. In Memphis, there's a Teach 901 that recruits around the country for better teachers to come into Memphis. And they do this through high tech, being driven to teacher programs where they're likely to be able to recruit, offering incentives that fashion, as Aaron was saying, that show the benefits of, in our case, Delaware, in their case, Memphis over other places, why you would want to move there. But in my view, we could do something seriously impactful with this amount of money if we focus in on how to make these changes more systematically and do recruitment and retention in a 21st century way rather than a 20th century kind of model that still works for most schools. It just doesn't work for high need schools.
Kristen.
I'd be really interested to take some of the research that you've done in other states, Dr. Henry, and talk about how we can build it out to do the same research here in Delaware or similar research. One thing I reached out to you over chat, you know, one question that's never asked, but is a huge problem amongst our educators is safety. So it wasn't surprising. It was surprising for me to see that it made its way on the survey, but I know that it's a huge issue, but it's not something that's necessarily asked of our educators in these types of surveys. So I would really be interested in, you know, collaborating with you to kind of mimic similar research here in Delaware. I would also say, you're right, one size doesn't fit all. And I would really encourage a lot of our districts to take a look at the research that could be created from this group or elsewhere and talk about it at the bargaining table. Because a lot of the changes that they tried that we know needed to have been made in the Christina School District had to be done through an MOU. And so I wouldn't always try, in some cases, to dictate at the state level. A lot of these conversations are hard conversations that may take a while. And I know Chuck just popped on, but have to be done because there's a contract in place and have to be done at a local and bargaining level, which is why I went back to, if we are getting research from other states, can we do it? Can we pull some research where they've made headway through a contract negotiations, where there's an active EA, and kind of learn from those experiences too. One of the biggest, most groundbreaking components of the MOU in Christina was the extra pay for the extra duties that they're doing in the high need schools. Like that's huge. And from the union standpoint, Chuck, I'll give you time to do it from the district standpoint, that had to be voted on by the entire EA, not just by the educators working in those high need schools. So you had to have the suburban teachers say and acknowledge they're doing more work, although they've always been doing more work in some respects. They need extra pay. Do you know what I mean? And that was bargained, and that was huge, you know. And I know we talk a lot about differentiated salary schedules. Remember, 30% of that is the local share, 70% of it is the state share. So one, I'd like to collaborate with you, Dr. Henry, and this group DOE to kind of do similar research to understand, because what I think we're going to find is the stuff that nationally gets a lot of headlines may not be what's important to keep teachers here in Delaware. And then two, don't discount the bargaining process. One, it's a wonderful way for districts and educators to talk when sometimes they can't, because it is a process. So,
which, by the way, is a great segue. So one, I love the collaboration on this settlement committee. Two, extra pay and resources, Chris. I'd like to remind you of that. Extra pay and resources. And this also, by the way, gets into the additional funding needed. If it's done at the bargaining table, I would love to see an increase of $200,000 for every high needs educator, especially on this teacher appreciation week. But that also means you need extra funding for it. And so the independent funding assessment and opportunity funding needs to be increased to match that. It's already in the settlement. So we don't have to seek out brand new funding. We love to increase it. But to what Gary and what Kristen, you're both saying, we need to actually make that a part of it. So want to segue, it's 6:08. Loving this conversation. I'm definitely seeing we're now at the bargaining table and looking at changing contracts. And I can tell you about leadership. I know Eastside has gone from 50% attrition rate to less than 20% in the last 5 years. It's because we've had stronger, consistent leadership, and also our staff actually on surveys, we've been tracking that do better. We're seeing the same data with a number of other schools we work with inside Delaware and outside of Delaware as well. And leadership matters a lot. So that's not a trying to talk about me. It's more so about the team and consistency in that. And it also helps when staff have their own children in the school. It means a lot. And as a parent at Eastside, I can speak about, yeah, the reason I put my own children in that school is because I need them to have the best education. So we're going to fight tooth and nail everybody on the planet to make sure that we do that. And our team does that well. So want to segue, it's 6:09, independent funding assessment and opportunity funding. Any thoughts on, we'll do independent funding assessment, a 10-minute conversation. We're going to actually cut it in 10 minutes because we're coming back in May 24th. By the way, I had a request. Secretary Bunting said she was offering John Niebauer for that conversation, because what we don't want to do is we have these great conversations, put plans together, and then it's already been done somewhere, and we end up having other conversations. So is a group of them to have John Niebauer come in, talk about where they are and our plans for next fiscal year 2022 and planning for 2023. Yay, thumbs up. No, I think it's a horrible idea to involve anybody from DOE at any meetings ever again as we try to work with DOE. I'm being facetious here. Thumb up from Gary. All right, cool. Kristen is a thumb up. I feel it inside her spirit. And I'm seeing that Larissa from First Aid, Monique, Rashawn, Antika, and Shannon all agree. I'm speaking for your screens. Cool. So John Niebauer will be at the next meeting. We're about 10, 15 minutes. Would love to hear from him. Secretary Bunting, you're on, but we'll make requests from Haley and Kelly as well. And I think we also want to spend time this summer collaborating, because you're right, our schools need that. I'm going to put 8 minutes on the clock. And when I say me, Haley or Kelly, you put 8 minutes on the clock. Thank you. 8 minutes on the clock. Same conversation about independent funding assessment. It's part of the settlement. It does get into, it could get into, do we change the unit funding model? And when I say we, I mean the legislature, and it also helps the legislature as a part of Reading Consortium. What do we need to do to even get into this conversation? And by the way, there's an independent group that's looking at this as well, that is also being financed to do it. So we're looking at what should be in the study, as well as things we'd love to see happen in the state. I think we're uniquely positioned within this group. Chuck, you put into the chat, you want to talk about that? Just given the parameters, as you, I just saw you put something in.
Yep, I just put the language from the settlement in there about the independent funding assessment. I absolutely agree with Kristen. It would be nice to know the timeline so we don't, we don't wake up one day and see a scope of work hit my marketplace.delaware.gov. Not that we own this, we don't, but we want to make sure that it really is, an equity driven thing, which is our role. So given that this assessment has to be completed by January 2024, it's not going to be done in 6 months. So it's not going to start July 1st. It's going to have to be funded for fiscal year 2023. So we should expect to see this item in next year's budget, unless it's being paid for out of some magic secret pot somewhere, which, happens from time to time. What do we think?
Dr. Henry?
You may have noticed I have no shortage of opinions, so I'll continue, but I'll try to be quick. First of all, I think, and I've talked with some of the folks on the call today about this before, but I think we should consider making this periodic, because Maryland does this kind of work and assembles a commission every X number of years. And you never get this thing right in a one-time fix-it-all kind of strategy. So doing it every 3-5 years should be something we consider. Number two is that we should be very wary of these large. There are about 4 or 5 organizations that do these studies. It's canned. You're going to get exactly what Maryland got, exactly what Pennsylvania got. So I think we need to be careful about how we define independent, because some of these firms are just giving you a cookie cutter approach with very little customization to the most important questions facing Delaware today. And the third is, I think we should work on, in some of our next meetings, laying out 8 to 10 really important research questions that would be answered through this study and prioritizing them. Aaron, you mentioned the unit count. You could also look at there's a ton of things that we could look at, from equity concerns, the weighted per pupil funding. We've got to prioritize, because no single study is going to do all of those things. And so I think first to have a blue sky session about what we think are most important funding issues, and then prioritizing those issues could be helpful, and at least putting some ideas forward and to DDOE and whoever else will be considering this.
Dr. Bunting, so glad to have you here. Is there an RFP, or when would an RFP, do you know, and the answer could be no, when the RFP will be done for the group to do the independent funding assessment?
No.
Okay, then I think that's a question we'll need to ask the department. And Kristen, to your same point there, I agree with you. We don't be in the same position again. So that'll be important.
And Aaron, John Neubauer said he would be glad to come. I put it on his calendar.
Oh, it's glad to have the secretary here. We get emails a lot faster.
Aaron, in response to what you're asking about with the RFP, I would think that if we're going to have some major input, if we want to have some influence, we got to have it done by this December 2021, because that's when the governor's recommended budget comes out. And, you know, as you saw, this the ombuds person got put in there, and then by June, the state needed to, they got a necessarily they got ahead of the game trying to get the RFP done so that they could hit the ground running in July. So that gives,
so that we would have them in place.
Yeah.
So
So we need to make sure that our input, and we might do this also in concert with the funding and governance group. They got CFOs and superintendents on there too. So we should go hand in hand with them. But you know, we're the agile ones, we're the nimble ones. We can run out ahead, but we got to have it by December 2021.
And that means October, we need to have our proposal done.
We will start talking budget as soon as we get to July 1st, you know, so that we turn into the governor's office long before that budget comes out.
So what would, in July, you're having the conversation for 2023.
Preliminarily, it's
Yeah.
almost as soon as we get one approved, Aaron, you start working on the next one.
Okay.
Now, you don't work on it every day, but you know, you begin thinking a whole year ahead.
So that looks like we got work to do this summer, team, and to get this, we'd love to get a framework to you, Secretary Bunting, in September. But that might be too late if you're looking at July to start the conversation.
I think December's okay.
December's all right?
Right. DOE is not going to put out an RFP ahead of the governor's recommended
No.
budget, which comes out in January. That just doesn't happen.
So are we talking something to go in the budget or the RFP?
We want to do the RFP, a framework, as well as some weights for that, because I think we'll have some questions ahead of time. And then also we're eagerly awaiting the report, which again is going to come out in 2024, to start looking at how we spend the $4 million every year thereafter from the settlement.
I'm thinking, Chuck, immediately of that budgeting of how we're going to spend. So, you know, the sooner, and just keep in touch with us about, you know, we can tell you, here's where we are. And
Mhm.
Aaron, we got to hurry because we need it by here, or December's fine, or January's fine, or whatever. But we don't want to be behind the 8 ball.
Perfect. Haley, I think that's 8 minutes. 6:19.
13 seconds.
You're spot on. Yep, 13 seconds.
So I'm getting things in the chat saying, hey, I gotta go. And people are about to head out. So here's where we are. One, Secretary Bunting, we're happy to have you here, and thank you for your transparency with sharing what you have and do not have, which is very helpful to us, especially because of our conversations about open communication. And we want to be a great thought partner, as well as we want to learn. So there are things we need to take back. We appreciate John Niebauer coming to our next meeting. Love the collaboration between Kristen, Chuck, and Gary as we look at revising all of the MOUs and the funding here. And for our next meeting, which is May 24th, we'll be sending you those appointments. We're going to finish up on independent funding assessment and the big one, opportunity funding, because we don't have to change everything in the state of Delaware. That's not the proposal. There's additional funding that's already there. So how we're going to use it, and if we get to a point that we feel like there's a better mechanism for Delaware, we can propose and see what happens. But that's going to be with definitely involving as many people as possible. So not the first go-to, but just not a possibility. Any questions from the group?
I have a question.
Yes, Secretary Martin.
As we talk about opportunity funding, all that money goes out to districts. Have you ever thought of including one of the chiefs in some of your conversations so that you can actually explore how it plays out in the field? You know, how it's used. If there are suggestions that you want to make, if you want to influence how it's spent, of course, it has to be directed toward English learners and low-income students, but how it's done, you may at some point want to have conversation with one of the chiefs just to get the district perspective.
Got it. I also spend opportunity funding through
Right,
our
charter.
charter as the LEA, and then Chuck here as well he's the guy that actually does the spending. We Darrell joins us every now and again.
Okay.
Green, and then we've enlisted a few others. I know Dan has been involved as well from Christina. So definitely agree with that. Our big thing with the opportunity funding, and at least for me, I can speak from Eastside, we are not clear the best practices for opportunity funding. And I know that the report that was done listed one of the things was we need more information. I think it's the RAND study that came out about opportunity funding. And so we would love to gather more information. So, hey, if every kid had a pink eraser versus a blue eraser, if every kid, HB 100 is an example of this, if every school had these mental health resources, then we can make sure that students have these supports. If every school had these certain things, because we don't have the information right now, and most districts and LEAs get into the school year and it's go time. So we'd love to say, hey, if every school had these certain things as a baseline, here's the next level. So I know we're looking with NTSS right now across the state, which I think will garner more information that has more needs. And especially if we're able to reduce the amount of students in tier 3 supports because of increased MTSS services, multi-tier systems of support. Tier 3 students are the higher need students within schools, which typically are students that then have bigger impact on the culture. I know, Secretary, you know that. I'm looking at our group. So just
I
make
happen
sure.
to know a little bit about opportunity funding too.
Hey. So that's the pieces we're looking at of how we can make that better, and learn as well as share information.
And there's our process too. We come up with recommendations. We recommend upward to the Reading Consortium itself. So nothing really leaves the consortium without their approval. And they do have several, they have some district superintendents on their group. And Aaron he's a charter chief, so he's on that group too. And then, so yeah, there's some filters along the way. So, you know, we're a cannon, but we're not a loose cannon.
Maybe, but yeah.
Yeah, they could probably bolt us down a little better in our carriage, but we're still, you know, we still have a process we have to go through.
Yeah. Agreed. Anything else? Independent funding assessment, opportunity funding. John Niebauer will be at the next meeting in May. The next meeting is May 24th. We'll see you then. As there's no public comment tonight. There's no public. Okay.
There's no
We have no
public.
members.
Perfect. Secretary Bunting, anything from the public?
No, 5 o'clock on the 24th.
5 o'clock on the 24th. Yes. All right. We'll
See
see
you
you
then.
then.
Thank
Have a
you.
good one.
Good night.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.